Welcome back to my YouTube channel. When I walked into that courtroom, the air was thick with a kind of tension that seemed almost alive, the kind that clings to your skin and whispers to your doubts. The walls were high and cold, their echoes swallowing every sound except the faint rustle of papers and the low murmur of voices. It wasn't just another legal hearing. It was a battlefield of pride, betrayal, and heartbreak. My son stood there, shoulders tense, his suit slightly wrinkled, as though he had wrestled with his own reflection before walking in. His eyes were distant, not angry, but tired, like a man who had spent too long defending himself from love turned cruel. Across from him sat my daughter-in-law, poised and calculating, her red lips curved in a faint smirk. Every flick of her wrist, every glance she threw toward my son, carried a message: "You've already lost." Her parents mirrored her arrogance, whispering among themselves, eyes glinting with judgment. I could feel the quiet satisfaction in their demeanor, as though this was the grand finale they had waited for, the day they would see my boy humiliated. I had raised my son to be gentle, to believe in kindness even when the world showed its teeth, but that kindness had been used against him. He had loved her too deeply, trusted her too completely, and when she turned that love into a weapon, he didn't know how to fight back. That was the cruel part of love. It often leaves the kindest hearts defenseless. As I watched him stand there, alone in that crowded room, I felt something shift inside me, a mother's ache that turned into resolve. I remembered every scraped knee I had kissed, every tear I had wiped from his childhood cheeks, every time he had said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll be fine." And now, watching him being mocked and belittled, I realized he wasn't fine, not today, not yet. The whispers around the courtroom grew louder, a cruel hum of speculation and gossip. People love stories of failure, especially when told about those who dared to love honestly. My hands tightened around my purse. I hadn't planned to interfere. I had come only to support him quietly from the back. But when I saw the flicker of humiliation cross his face, that small, heartbreaking moment when he lowered his gaze as laughter rippled faintly through the room, I knew I couldn't stay still. There comes a moment in every parent's life when silence feels like betrayal. I rose slowly, my heart steady, my steps deliberate. Every click of my heel against that marble floor felt like a heartbeat, echoing through the silence that began to fall. My son didn't see me yet, but I was there, the quiet force behind him, walking into the storm he didn't deserve. The painful truth about their marriage had been slowly unfolding long before that day in court. What began as a love story, full of laughter, promises, and late-night conversations, had turned into a battlefield where kindness was mistaken for weakness and devotion became ammunition. My son had fallen in love with her completely, the way dreamers do, believing that patience could heal wounds and love could fix everything. I remember the glow in his eyes when he first introduced her to me. She was charming then, polite, graceful, and sweet-spoken, the kind of woman any mother would have been happy to welcome into her family. But over time, the sweetness faded, replaced by something colder. She began to chip away at his confidence, little by little, until he questioned his worth in his own home. The laughter that once filled their apartment was replaced by tense silence and carefully chosen words. She learned how to twist every disagreement into proof that he was the problem, that he wasn't enough. I watched my son shrink under the weight of trying to please someone who only took joy in finding his faults. He had always been too forgiving, a trait I admired when he was young, but one that broke my heart now. He thought love meant enduring pain quietly, that keeping peace meant sacrificing himself. I tried to talk to him once, gently, to tell him that love should never make you feel small. But he only smiled faintly and said, "Mom, she just needs time. Things will get better." They didn't. Instead, they worsened. She began to control everything, his words, his finances, even his friendships. And when she realized he wouldn't fight back, she went further, painting herself as the victim in every story she told. Her parents, proud and sharp-tongued, believed every word she said. They never saw the man who stayed up late fixing the things she broke, the man who gave more than he ever took. They only saw the picture she painted, the one where she was the suffering wife and he was the careless husband. By the time they decided to separate, she had already prepared her strategy. She wanted everything, the house, the car, even their child, and she wanted to destroy his name while taking it. She mocked him not just in court but in whispers to mutual friends, spreading half-truths that bruised his reputation and scarred his spirit. Sitting in that courtroom, I could feel the weight of her manipulations pressing down on him. Every accusation she made was rehearsed, every tear strategically placed. Her voice trembled at all the right moments, her expression perfectly composed to win sympathy. She had turned deceit into performance, and yet my son stood there quietly, not to defend himself but to protect the last bit of dignity he had left. Even when she insulted him, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I just want peace." And that somehow made her angrier. Because people like her don't understand peace, they feed on power. I sat there watching, torn between heartbreak and fury. I wanted to stand up, to shout the truth for everyone to hear, about the countless nights he cried alone, the way she drained his spirit while pretending to love him. But I stayed quiet, knowing the right moment hadn't come yet. Little did I know, that moment would come sooner than anyone expected. And when it did, every lie she had built would start to crumble, not through anger, but through the quiet presence of truth itself. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy rhythm, her lawyer speaking with theatrical confidence, my son answering with calm restraint, and the judge scribbling notes without looking up. Then came the moment that changed everything. When I rose from the back and began walking down the aisle, I could feel dozens of eyes following me. My heels echoed through the silence, steady, deliberate, almost defiant. My son didn't notice me at first. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his hands clenched together, a man standing on the edge of hopelessness. But the judge did. The instant our eyes met, the air shifted. His expression froze mid-motion and his pen fell still. For a brief moment, the confident rhythm of the courtroom broke, as if time itself paused between two heartbeats. His lips parted slightly, confusion flickering across his face, followed by recognition, and something deeper. He leaned forward, his voice low but audible enough to ripple through the silence. "Why are you here?" The question wasn't just surprise. It carried weight, memory, and unspoken history. I could see it in his eyes, the flood of recognition that pulled him backward in time. He wasn't just seeing a mother walking in. He was seeing a face from a part of his life he'd never expected to meet again. Whispers stirred among the audience. My daughter-in-law's smirk faltered, and she turned to see what had startled the judge. Her parents, who had been so confidently leaning forward, exchanged uneasy glances. The entire energy in the room shifted, from arrogance to confusion, from certainty to doubt. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, visibly trying to compose himself. "Proceed," he said softly, but his tone had changed. It was no longer mechanical or detached. It carried the quiet caution of a man suddenly aware of the truth behind the case he was about to decide. He remembered me. Years ago, before retirement, I had worked with the Legal Aid Foundation, a group dedicated to defending those who had no voice. He had been a young attorney then, full of fire but still learning to balance compassion with law. We had fought cases side by side, and he had often said, "You don't fight for justice with anger. You fight with truth." It had been decades since then, but in that one glance, I could tell he still carried those words. I stood quietly behind my son as the proceedings resumed, my hands folded in front of me. I could feel the tension rising, the uncertainty rippling through my daughter-in-law's side of the room. The judge's gaze shifted between her and my son, lingering slightly longer on her every time she spoke, as though searching for sincerity that wasn't there. Her lawyer continued with his usual confidence, but his words started to falter. The judge began asking sharper questions, probing into inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed before. The truth, once buried beneath performance and pretense, began to surface in small, undeniable fragments. My daughter-in-law's calm demeanor began to crack. Her tone grew defensive, her explanations thinner, her parents' silence heavier. And I stood there, not saying a word, letting my presence speak louder than anything I could have said aloud. The judge didn't look at me again, not directly. But his every action after that moment carried a quiet respect. Not for who I was then, but for what I represented now. The truth he had once believed in, standing in flesh and blood before him. For my son, that moment marked the beginning of a shift he couldn't yet understand. The storm that had consumed him for months had finally begun to break, not because of argument or evidence, but because the truth had walked back into the room, quietly, unannounced, and unstoppable. The silence that followed was unlike any other, thick, tense, and almost electric. It was as if the entire courtroom had forgotten how to breathe. Even the faint sound of papers rustling ceased. My daughter-in-law's face, once so composed, began to lose its confident edge. Her smile trembled as she shifted in her seat, eyes darting between the judge and me, trying to understand what had just changed. Her parents looked equally unsettled, their earlier smirks replaced by nervous glances and stiff postures. They didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath them had already begun to crack. The judge's tone was different now. Gone was the distant professionalism that had marked the earlier proceedings. In its place was a calm, piercing scrutiny that cut through every sentence spoken. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, his questions precise. "Mrs. Ahmed," he said slowly, "earlier you claimed your husband failed to support you financially. Can you clarify these deposits to your personal account during that same period?" His words were polite, but the weight behind them made her flinch. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his documents with forced confidence. "Your Honor, those funds," he began, but the judge raised his hand lightly, silencing him. "I'm asking her," he said, voice low but commanding. It was no longer a performance. It was a reckoning. I watched my son lift his head slightly, confusion mixing with hope in his eyes. He had grown so used to losing that fairness felt foreign to him. He glanced back and saw me standing there, calm, quiet, unshaken. And in that moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he once was, the boy who believed that good people still won sometimes. My daughter-in-law's voice faltered as she tried to answer, but the judge pressed further. "And you also stated that your husband refused to let you work," he continued, "yet these employment records indicate you held a position for over a year. Is that correct?" Her silence spoke louder than her words ever could. The arrogance that had filled her voice earlier vanished, replaced by hesitation. Her eyes, once cold and confident, now flickered with panic. The courtroom audience, lawyers, clerks, even the bailiff, began to sense the shift. What had started as a spectacle of humiliation was transforming into a quiet revelation of truth. The same people who had been whispering about my son now sat in stillness, watching the cracks form in the story she had so carefully built. I could feel my heart pounding, not out of triumph, but from the weight of justice slowly balancing itself. There was no need for me to speak. My presence had already changed the rhythm of the room. The judge's every word, every question, carried the gravity of someone who now understood he was standing in the shadow of truth, not manipulation. Her parents, once bold and dismissive, began exchanging worried glances. Her father whispered something under his breath, but she ignored him, too busy fumbling with her papers, her confidence slipping through her fingers like sand. For the first time, her mask cracked. She wasn't the clever, wounded wife anymore. She was simply human, flawed, exposed, and cornered by the very lies she had crafted. When the judge called for a short recess, the room remained silent. My son turned to me slowly, disbelief and relief battling in his eyes. I didn't move closer, didn't say a word. I just nodded once, letting him know that this was not the end, but the turning point. When the session resumed, the energy in the courtroom felt entirely different. It was no longer my son standing alone against falsehood. It was truth standing tall beside him. The judge's tone had softened, but his authority had deepened, his questions sharper, yet more just. The performance that had once favored my daughter-in-law was unraveling thread by thread, and everyone could feel it. My son's voice, which had been quiet and unsure at the start of the day, began to carry strength. There was something new in his posture, a steadiness, a quiet pride. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was reclaiming his dignity. For months, he had been made to believe he was the problem, that his silence was weakness. But now that same silence became his power. Each time he spoke, it wasn't out of anger, but truth, calm, measured, undeniable. When he answered the judge's questions, he looked no longer like a defeated man, but like someone who had finally remembered who he was. I could see in his eyes that something inside him had shifted. He was no longer speaking for her to understand or for the audience to pity him. He was speaking for himself, for his peace, his name, his worth. And in that, there was a kind of beauty that words can't fully describe. My daughter-in-law sat frozen, her earlier confidence drained away. Her hands trembled as she shuffled her papers, searching for words that no longer held meaning. The judge's steady gaze didn't allow her to hide behind tears or charm anymore. Every time she tried to twist her story, he guided her back to the facts, until even her own lawyer began to falter. The courtroom that had once been her stage was now her mirror, reflecting the truth she had tried so hard to bury. And I stood behind my son, not as his defender, not as his shield, but as his reminder. A mother's love doesn't need to be loud. It exists in the quiet assurance that says, "I'm here. You're not alone." I didn't need to speak for him. Just being there was enough to awaken the strength he'd forgotten he had. When the proceedings finally ended, the judge leaned back, his expression thoughtful. He removed his glasses slowly, then looked directly at my son. "I have heard enough," he said quietly, "and I have seen enough." His gaze shifted briefly to me, a silent acknowledgement, before he turned back to the courtroom. "Justice," he said, "isn't about who can speak the loudest. It's about who stands in truth, even when the world doubts them." A ripple of silence followed those words, not the awkward, tense silence from before, but one filled with realization. Even my daughter-in-law seemed to understand, for the first time, the weight of what she had done. Her arrogance melted into shame, and her parents sat rigid beside her, unable to meet anyone's eyes. My son turned toward me slowly, tears forming but unfallen, his chest rising with a deep breath that seemed to release months of pain. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything: gratitude, love, and the quiet rebirth of hope. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to set, casting long golden light across the steps. As we walked out, the air felt lighter, almost sacred. My son stopped halfway down, turned to face me, and whispered, "Thank you for coming." I smiled, brushing a hand over his shoulder. "I didn't come to save you," I said softly. "I came to remind you who you are." For a long moment we stood there, mother and son, no longer broken, no longer afraid. Sometimes victory doesn't roar. It breathes quietly in the spaces where truth finally finds its voice. And in that fading light, I saw him stand taller than I ever had before. Not because I walked behind him, but because he finally walked in the truth ahead of me. In the days that followed, everything began to change. Not in grand, cinematic ways, but in small, deeply human ones. My son started to live again. He began to smile without hesitation, to breathe without the weight of constant defense. The judgment went in his favor, of course, but what mattered more was what it restored in him: his sense of self, his belief that kindness wasn't weakness, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way back home. My daughter-in-law quietly disappeared from our lives after that. No apologies, no explanation, just silence. And that was enough. Not every story needs a villain punished. Sometimes the greatest justice is peace. Her arrogance had burned itself out, and in its ashes, my son found freedom. The judge reached out a few weeks later, a simple note, handwritten, thanking me for reminding him why he chose the path of law in the first place. It was a gesture I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. Life has a way of circling back, of letting truth meet truth in the most unexpected places. One evening, as the sun dipped low over our backyard, my son sat beside me, his little daughter playing in the grass. She ran toward him, laughter filling the air, and I saw in that moment everything we had fought for. Not revenge, not pride, but continuity. The chance for him to love again, without fear. I realized then that strength isn't always loud or defiant. Sometimes, it's the quiet step a mother takes when her child is on the edge of breaking. It's walking into a room full of lies with nothing but truth in your heart. It's believing that love, when it's real and pure, can endure even in the face of betrayal. That day in court wasn't just the end of a painful chapter. It was the beginning of my son's redemption, and a reminder that when truth walks in, even the proudest lies fall silent.